Tonight, I return to the back of the yards, not the polished tale, but the cold, heavy truth beneath the brim of a stockman's cap. I remember the stench of blood and brine, the endless bellowing of cattle cars rolling through morning fog, a handful of Lithuanian families hardened by killing floors and winter wind, moving at the unhurried pace of survival. If this quiet kind of history brings you a little peace, I would be grateful if you pressed like, and if you'd like more nights like this, you can subscribe. If you wish, leave a quiet note with where you're listening from, and what hour finds you drifting into these old stories. Thank you for sharing this evening with me. Now, dim the lights. Let the creak of wooden chutes, the steam hissing from scalding tanks, the distant whistle of the Illinois Central soften the room. Settle in and let's begin with the empire built on bones and the book that brought it all crashing down. I remember when Chicago was just a trading post, where the river bent toward the lake, before the fire came, before the steel mills stretched their arms along the shore, before the great yards rose from the swampland like a fever dream of commerce and blood. Back then, you could still hear the prairie in the wind. The year was 1865, and Christmas Day fell on a Monday. While families gathered around tables heavy with goose and pudding, while children unwrapped their few small gifts, snow dusted the wooden sidewalks of a city still rebuilding itself. Something else was being born in the marshy wasteland southwest of the river. 320 acres of cattails and standing water, frozen mud that squelched underfoot, the kind of land that decent men walked round, not through, but some dreams are too large for decent land. Some visions require swamps. The Union Stockyard and Transit Company opened that Christmas morning with little ceremony and great ambition. A handful of men in city clothes are learning to walk in mud. Steam rising from the first wooden pens, the smell of fresh timber mixing with the older, deeper scent of the earth giving way to something new. They called it progress. They called it the future. They called it a lot of things. Those men who stood in the cold that morning, watching the first cattle cars roll down the newly laid tracks. But I remember what it really was, the birth of an empire, built on the simple understanding that everything living could be transformed into something profitable. Everything but the squeal, they would later say. But that morning there was only silence. The silence of snow falling on empty pens. The silence of a swamp holding its breath before the flood of commerce swept it all away. Tonight we'll walk through that empire. We'll meet the people who built it with their hands and their backs and sometimes their lives. We'll follow a young socialist writer as he trades his name for 7 weeks of truth. We'll watch a single book shake a nation's faith in its own stomach. And we'll remember that some stories once told can never be untold. The stench of blood and sweat, the endless procession of cattle cars, the backs bent beneath the weight of survival, the names of those who labored in shadows, their lives folded into the great machinery of the yards. I remember the sharp clang of the iron gates swinging, the steam rising from scalding tanks, the distant whistle of the Illinois Central echoing over the yards. It was a symphony of labor, harsh but rhythmic, beneath a sky that never seemed to clear. Young men with faces hardened by cold and work, moving with the slow certainty of routine. The unspoken code of the yard's respect the machine, endure the pain, keep your head down, their stories buried beneath layers of rust and grime. The book was The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, a young writer with fire in his eyes and a determination to uncover the truth. He stepped into the yards and never looked away, capturing the grime and heartache with unflinching eyes. The nation's faith in its own stomach trembled. The images Sinclair painted were not of myth, but of flesh and blood, bone and bloodied hands. A new era dawned one, where the shadows could no longer be ignored. Some stories, once told, change everything. The men who labored in the yards, the endless flow of livestock, the cold iron tracks stretching into the unknown, they built an empire, but it came at a price few cared to see. I remember the sound of heavy boots on frozen mud, the sharp metallic clang of gates swinging open, the hiss of steam from great boilers. It was a harsh symphony, but one that carried the pulse of a city hungry for growth. In the back of the yards, families from Lithuania, Poland, and beyond found themselves caught in a world both cruel and relentless, their lives intertwined with the fate of animals, machines, and the city itself. These people bore the weight of the yards on their backs and in their hearts. Every day was a battle with the cold, the mud, the endless noise, and the invisible walls of poverty and despair. And tonight, as we settle into this history, I ask you to listen softly, to let the sounds and sights of that forgotten empire wash over you like the winter fog over the yards. Let us begin. What grows in a swamp when you feed it enough dreams and blood? I remember the first time I saw the plans spread across a mahogany table in the Palmer House, 1864, and Chicago was still tasting ash from the great fire that would come 7 years later. But these men, John Sherman, the railroad lawyer, and Benjamin Hutchinson, who knew grain like other men knew their wives, they weren't looking backward. They were sketching the future in ink and ambition across survey maps of worthless marshland, 320 acres of cattails and standing water, 8 miles southwest of the city proper, land so wet that even the Irish wouldn't build there, so remote that you needed a good horse and a full day to reach it from State Street, so perfectly, impossibly useless that it could be bought for the price of a decent downtown lot. But location, location was everything. The railroads were coming from everywhere at once. The Illinois Central already snaked down from the north. The Michigan Southern pushed in from the east. The Rock Island stretched its steel fingers toward the setting sun. And Chicago, young, hungry, rebuilding itself with every passing season, sat at the center of it all, like a spider in a web of iron and steam. The cattle were already coming to great herds, driven up from Texas, following trails worn smooth by a million hooves. Longhorns, mostly lean and wild-eyed, carrying the dust of 1,000 miles on their hides. They arrived in Chicago in scattered lots, sold in whatever pen space could be found, processed in small slaughterhouses scattered throughout the city. It was inefficient, wasteful, primitive. The men around that mahogany table saw something else entirely. They saw the future flowing like water finding its level. All the cattle of the West funneled into one great gathering place. All the railroads converging on a single point. All the slaughtering, all the processing, all the shipping concentrated into one vast, efficient machine. They saw the Union Stockyard and Transit Company. The paperwork was filed on February 13th, 1865. Capital stock, $1 million, an almost unimaginable sum in a city where a working man earned $12 a week if he was lucky. The investors included some of the most powerful names in Chicago. The McCormicks of Harvester fame, the armors who were already making money in grain, the railroad men who understood that the future belonged to whoever controlled the flow of goods. But first, they had to drain a swamp. The work began that spring as soon as the ground thawed enough to drive stakes. Crews of Irish laborers, men who knew ditches and drainage from the old country, arrived with shovels and determination. They cut channels through the marsh grass, built crude wooden bridges across the deeper pools, laid the first rough roads on foundations of broken stone and hope. The smell was something to behold. Centuries of standing water and rotting vegetation disturbed for the first time since the glaciers retreated. It rose from the churned earth like the breath of something long dead and newly awakened. The men worked with handkerchiefs tied round their faces, but the smell found its way in anyway. It settled into their clothes, their hair, their dreams. By summer, the first buildings were rising from the drained land. Rough wooden structures built for utility, not beauty. Office buildings, a small hotel, a telegraph station that would connect the yards to markets across the continent, and the pens, hundreds upon hundreds of wooden pens, each one capable of holding 50 head of cattle, arranged in neat rows like a military encampment. The Illinois Central agreed to run spur lines directly to the yards. So did the Michigan Southern, the Pittsburgh and Fort Wayne, the Burlington. 15 different railroad companies, putting aside their fierce competition for the promise of concentrated traffic. Each would pay the Union Stockyard and Transit Company $2 per car for the privilege of using the facilities. $2 per car multiplied by thousands of cars per month. The mathematics of it were beautiful in their simplicity. But mathematics meant nothing without cattle, and cattle meant nothing without buyers, and buyers meant nothing without the infrastructure to process what they bought. The yards would need slaughterhouses. They would need cold storage. They would need an army of skilled butchers, and an even larger army of men willing to do the work that's skilled. Butchers wouldn't touch. They would need immigrants. The first test came on Christmas Day, 1865. Snow was falling across the empty pens when the morning train pulled in from the east, carrying a delegation of cattle buyers from New York. They stepped down onto the wooden platform. City men in good wool coats, their breath steaming in the cold air. They looked around at the wooden buildings, the empty pens, the endless rows of fencing stretching away toward the horizon. One of them, a man named Morrison, who bought beef for the restaurants of Manhattan, shook his head and laughed. "You expect us to do business in a swamp," he said. John Sherman, the railroad lawyer who had helped dream the place into existence, gestured toward the rail yards where 3 different lines converged. "Gentlemen," he said, "you're looking at the center of the universe." The first cattle arrived that afternoon. 200 head of Illinois corn-fed steers driven down from Mendota on the Illinois Central. They stumbled out of the cattle cars, stiff-legged and confused, their eyes wide with the trauma of the journey. The drovers herded them into the nearest pen, where they stood in the snow and lowed mournfully, as if sensing what was to come. By evening, they were sold. Morrison himself bought 50 head at 4 cents a pound, live weight. Other buyers took the rest. By midnight, the first cattle were being slaughtered in a small processing plant hastily erected at the edge of the yards. The Union stockyards were officially in business, but business was not yet empire. That would take time and immigrants, and a gradual understanding that efficiency could be pushed to levels that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. It would take men willing to think of living creatures as raw materials, and other men desperate enough to transform those raw materials with their own hands, hour after hour, day after day, until the rhythm of it became the rhythm of their hearts. The Irish came first, fleeing famine and English landlords. They built the pens and laid the railroad tracks and dug the drainage, ditches that kept the yards from sinking back into the swamp. They were followed by the Germans, craftsmen, and butchers who brought Old World skills to New World efficiency. Then came the Scandinavians, Swedes, and Norwegians who had crossed an ocean in search of something better than fishing boats and failed farms. Each wave of immigrants pushed the previous wave up the economic ladder or out of the yards entirely. The Irish became foremen and supervisors. The Germans opened their own small slaughterhouses on the edges of the district. The Scandinavians took over the skilled work, the cutting and trimming that required steady hands and sharp eyes, and always the yards grew larger. Finally, the carcasses enter the cooling rooms, vast refrigerated spaces where they hang for days, while the meat ages and tenderizes. The temperature is maintained at exactly 34 degrees Fahrenheit cold, enough to prevent spoilage, not so cold as to freeze the meat solid. From the moment a live steer entered the killing floor to the moment the last cut of meat was loaded onto a refrigerated car bound for eastern markets, the entire process took less than 4 hours. What had once required a skilled butcher working alone for the better part of a day could now be accomplished by 15 men, each performing a single specialized task, working in coordination. It was efficient beyond anything the world had ever seen. It was profitable beyond the dreams of previous generations of meat dealers, and it required a constant supply of men willing to do work that most people preferred not to think about. The Big Five recruited workers the same way they recruited cattle from wherever they could be found most cheaply. The Irish had built the yards, but they'd moved on to better jobs as the city grew around them. The Germans had the skills but demanded the wages of craftsmen. The Scandinavians were reliable, but too few in number for the massive labor requirements of industrial-scale slaughter. The solution came from Eastern Europe. Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia countries most Americans couldn't locate on a map, populated by people whose languages sounded foreign and harsh, to ears accustomed to English and German. They were peasants, mostly accustomed to hard work and low expectations. They were willing to work for wages that American-born workers would reject. They were desperate enough to take jobs that more established immigrants had learned to avoid. And they kept coming year after year, as word spread through the villages of Eastern Europe that there was work in Chicago for men strong enough to do it. The Big Five didn't concern themselves with the details of their workers' lives. Their responsibility was to their shareholders, to the efficiency of their operations, to the profits that could be extracted from the transformation of living animals into marketable commodities. If workers were injured, they could be replaced. If workers organized for better conditions, they could be fired and replaced with hungrier workers from the endless supply arriving from Europe. The disassembly line demanded total subordination to its rhythm. A man who worked on the killing floors learned to move his hands without thinking, to make the same cuts in the same sequence hundreds of times each day. He learned to ignore the smell of blood and rendered fats. He learned to work in temperatures that ranged from the stifling heat of the cooking rooms to the bitter cold of the refrigeration chambers. he learned to treat the carcasses moving past him not as the remains of living creatures, but as pieces of raw material requiring processing. Most of all, he learned that his own body was just another piece of machinery in the larger system, valuable only as long as it could perform its assigned function at the required speed. The Big Five understood this. They'd designed their operations around this understanding. Men were components, no different from the steam engines that powered their saws or the refrigeration systems that preserved their products. Components could be maintained when necessary, replaced when they wore out, upgraded when better versions became available. It was a coldly logical approach to industrial organization. It was also wildly profitable. By 1890, the combined operations of the Big Five processed over 9 million cattle, hogs, and sheep annually. They employed over 25,000 workers directly and supported perhaps 50,000 more jobs in related industries: transportation, packaging, equipment manufacturing, wholesale and retail distribution. The profits were staggering. Swift and Company reported earnings of over $2 million in 1891. Armour and Company exceeded $3 million the same year. The other three companies earned proportional amounts. Altogether, the Big Five controlled over 80% of the meat processing capacity in the United States. They'd achieved something unprecedented in human history: the complete industrialization of death, operated on a scale that dwarfed anything previous civilizations had imagined possible. But industrialization always comes with costs. And in the meatpacking industry, those costs were paid primarily by the workers who fed their bodies and their lives into the machinery of production. The Big Five had created a system of tremendous efficiency and profitability. They'd also created a system that treated human beings as expendable resources, no more valuable than the animals being processed. The disassembly line had transformed not just the meat industry, but the very relationship between capital and labor, between efficiency and humanity, between the pursuit of profit and the acknowledgement of suffering. It was a masterpiece of industrial organization. It was also a horror that would haunt the American conscience. Once someone found a way to make that horror visible to those who consumed its products but never witnessed its methods. The Big Five had built their empire on the simple understanding that consumers wanted cheap, abundant meat and didn't want to know too much about how it was produced. They'd created a system that could deliver exactly that cheap, abundant meat, produced by methods that were invisible to everyone except the men and women who worked on the killing floors. The empire of meat was complete. All it needed now was someone to tell its story. How do you turn death into an art form? I remember the first time I watched Gustavus Swift walk the killing floors of his plant on Halsted Street. This was 1882, and Swift was already becoming something more than a businessman. He was becoming a force of nature, a man who looked at the ancient relationship between humans and the animals they consumed and saw inefficiency everywhere. He moved through the plant like a general inspecting troops, his sharp eyes taking in every detail: the speed of the knife work, the temperature of the cooling rooms, the precise moment when a carcass moved from one station to the next. Nothing escaped his attention, because nothing could be allowed to escape. In the world Swift was building, waste was the only sin that mattered. Swift had come to Chicago from Massachusetts, where his family had been butchers for generations. But what Swift understood, what separated him from every small-town butcher who had ever sharpened a knife, was scale. Not just selling meat to the people who lived nearby, but selling meat to everyone, everywhere, all the time. The problem was preservation. Cattle were heavy, expensive to ship alive, prone to injury and death during transport. But dressed beef meat that had been slaughtered and processed spoiled within days unless kept cold, and keeping things cold while they traveled hundreds of miles in the summer heat. That was a problem that had never been solved, until Swift solved it. The refrigerated railroad car was not exactly Swift's invention. Others had experimented with ice-cooled freight cars before, but Swift perfected it, and more importantly, Swift understood what it meant. A dressed steer that weighed 800 pounds live would yield perhaps 500 pounds of marketable meat. Ship the live animal and you paid freight on 800 pounds. Ship the dressed meat in a refrigerated car and you paid freight on 500 pounds, and arrived with a product ready for immediate sale. The mathematics were beautiful. The implications were revolutionary. By 1885, Swift's refrigerated cars were rolling into New York and Philadelphia and Boston, carrying Chicago beef to markets that had never tasted Western meat. Local butchers protested. Eastern cattle raisers demanded protective legislation. Consumers worried about the quality of meat that had traveled so far from its origins. Swift didn't care about the protests. He cared about the numbers, and the numbers told him he was right. But Swift was not alone in his vision. Chicago was attracting men who thought in continental terms, who saw the growing industrial might of America and understood that fortunes would be made by those who could organize that might most efficiently. Philip Armour had made his first fortune selling pork to the Union. Army during the Civil War, he'd learned that government contracts were lucrative, but government contracts ended. What didn't end was the need to feed the growing cities of the East, the expanding populations of immigrants who wanted meat on their tables and had wages to pay for it. Armour's plant at 39th and Halsted was larger than Swift's, more mechanized, more ruthlessly efficient, where other packers still relied on skilled butchers working with traditional tools. Armour installed overhead rails that moved carcasses from station to station, steam-powered saws that could split a steer in minutes, conveyor systems that eliminated the need for men to carry heavy cuts of meat. The disassembly line, they called it, and it was exactly that, an assembly line running in reverse, taking apart instead of putting together, reducing living creatures to their component parts with the precision of clockwork. Nelson Morris controlled the third largest operation in the yards. His plant specialized in sheep and lamb, processing thousands of animals daily for markets across the Midwest. Maurice had started as a small-time cattle dealer, buying and selling livestock at country markets in Wisconsin. But he'd recognized early that the future lay not in trading animals, but in processing them. Michael Cudahy had worked for Armour before establishing his own packing house. He brought with him Armour's methods, but added innovations of his own, better refrigeration systems, more efficient waste disposal, new techniques for curing and smoking that allowed meat to travel even farther from its point of origin. Samuel Wilson founded what would become Wilson and Company, initially focusing on the byproducts that other packers discarded: hides for leather, bones for fertilizer, blood for sausage casings, fat for soap and candles. Wilson understood that in an industry operating on thin margins, profit lay not just in the primary product, but in finding uses for everything else. Together, they became known as the Big Five: Swift, Armour, Morris, Cudahy, and Wilson. 5 men who transformed an ancient craft into a modern industry, who took the killing of animals, something humans had done for millennia in small numbers, locally, seasonally and industrialized it beyond recognition. The disassembly line was their masterpiece. Picture it. A steer enters the killing floor through a narrow chute, following other steers in a steady procession. The line moves at a predetermined pace, not too fast, which would result in waste and injury, not too slow, which would reduce daily output. Every few seconds, another animal reaches the first station. The knocker stands ready with his sledgehammer, one blow precisely delivered to the center of the forehead. The animal drops immediately, unconscious but still alive. This is crucial. The heart must still be beating to pump out the blood. The steer moves down the line, suspended now from an overhead rail by chains attached to its hind legs. At the next station, the sticker makes a deep cut across the throat, severing the major arteries. Blood pours out into collection troughs below. Nothing is wasted. The blood will be processed into sausage casings, sold to bakeries for blood puddings, dried and ground for fertilizer. The carcass continues moving. The skinners work with long, sharp knives, peeling hide away from flesh in smooth, continuous motions. They've been doing this work for years, their hands moving with the automatic precision of machinery. A skilled skinner can completely remove a hide in less than 3 minutes without nicking the valuable leather or wasting edible meat. Next come the splitters, who use steam-powered saws to cut the carcass in half along the spine. The two halves continue down separate lines now, each half destined for different processing procedures. The hindquarters, where the most valuable cuts are located, the forequarters, tougher meat that will be ground for sausage or canned goods. The gutters remove the internal organs with surgical precision. Heart, liver, and tongue go to specialty markets that pay premium prices. Intestines are cleaned and processed for sausage casings. Even the contents of the stomach, partially digested grass and grain, are saved for fertilizer production. The trimmers remove excess fat, which will be rendered into lard. They separate the different grades of meat: prime cuts for steakhouses, secondary cuts for regular retail sale, scraps for grinding. Every piece of the animal is categorized, weighed, and directed toward its designated purpose. I remember the first time I walked down Ashland Avenue on a Sunday morning in 1895, when the killing floors were silent and the neighborhood could almost pretend to be something other than what it was. The smell was still there, which was always there, but softer somehow, mixed with the smoke from cooking fires and the sound of church bells ringing in languages most Americans had never heard. Lithuanian bells from St. George's, calling the faithful to services conducted in a tongue that carried the weight of forests and ancient songs. Polish bells from St. Joseph's, where men who'd worked all week with blood under their fingernails knelt before carved saints and whispered prayers in the language of their childhoods. Slovak bells from Saints Cyril and Methodius, where families gathered to sing hymns that their grandchildren would remember long after the yards were gone. On Sunday mornings, you could almost forget what Packingtown was built for. Almost the neighborhood had grown like a living thing around the yards, spreading outward from the killing floors in concentric circles of desperation and hope. Closest to the plants were the boarding houses where single men slept 3 to a bed, sharing rooms that had been built for one. Then came the tenements, where families crowded into apartments with no running water and privies shared by entire buildings. Further out, if you had steady work and could save a few dollars, You might rent a small wooden house with its own yard and the luxury of walls that didn't shake every time your neighbor turned in his sleep. But even the best neighborhoods in Packingtown carried the mark of the yards. The smell, yes, but more than that, the understanding that everything here existed only because men were willing to spend their days killing animals for wages. The Rudkus family, not their real name, of course, but the name they would become known by when their story was finally told, arrived in Packingtown on a Tuesday in April 1896. Georges Rudkus was 26 years old, broad-shouldered and strong-backed, with the kind of hands that had spent years working soil that belonged to other men. His wife, Ona, was 18, pregnant with their first child, carrying in her belly the hopes they'd brought from Lithuania, along with their few possessions. They'd heard about Chicago in their village outside Vilnius. Everyone had heard about Chicago, the city where work was plentiful and wages were paid in American dollars. The city where a man who was willing to work hard could save enough money to buy land, to build something permanent, to give his children opportunities that had never existed in the old country. The steamship passage had cost them most of their savings. The train from New York had taken the rest. They arrived in Chicago with less than $20 between them, 2 canvas bags containing everything they owned, and the address of a cousin who'd written to say he could help them find work and a place to live. The cousin met them at Union Station and led them through streets that seemed to stretch forever, past buildings taller than anything they'd imagined, through crowds of people speaking dozens of languages they didn't recognize. The city was overwhelming in its size and noise and endless motion, but it was also exhilarating. This was America. This was the place where dreams became reality through the simple mechanism of honest work, fairly rewarded. The cousin lived in a wooden tenement building on Emerald Avenue, 4 blocks from the Swift plant where he worked as a beef trimmer. The building housed 42 people in 12 rooms. Georges and Ona were given space in a room they would share with the cousin's family and 2 other Boarder's Aid people, total in a space barely large enough for 4. The rent was $4 a week. The cousin explained this was reasonable for Packingtown, where housing was scarce and landlords knew that immigrants had few choices. $4 a week was more than Georges had ever paid for anything in Lithuania, but the cousin assured him that American wages would make it seem like nothing. The next morning, Georges walked to the Swift plant to look for work. He joined a crowd of men who gathered each dawn outside the employment office, hoping to catch the foreman's eye, hoping to be chosen from among the dozens of applicants for each available position. The men spoke Polish and Lithuanian and Slovak and German, but they all understood the universal language of need. The foreman was a thick-set Irish American named Murphy, who'd started working in the yards 15 years earlier and had climbed through the ranks by understanding that loyalty to the company was the only virtue that mattered. He looked over the crowd of applicants with the eye of a man selecting livestock, choosing the strongest backs and the most desperate faces. Georges was chosen. His first job was in the beef-killing department, carrying carcasses from the killing floor to the cooling rooms. It was unskilled work that paid 15 cents an hour, but it was work, and work meant survival. The killing floor was like nothing Georges had ever experienced. The noise alone, the bellowing of terrified cattle, the hiss of steam, the clang of machinery, the shouts of men trying to communicate over the din was overwhelming, But louder than any of that was the smell. Blood and rendered fat and something else, something organic and overwhelming that seemed to coat the inside of his nostrils and throat. The work was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Carcasses came down the disassembly line at a predetermined pace. Jurgis's job was to lift each carcass to 100 pounds of dead weight and carry it 50 feet to the cooling room entrance, then return for the next carcass, then repeat for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. The first day he managed to keep pace with the line. The second day his shoulders ached so badly he could barely lift his arms. By the end of the first week, his hands were raw from gripping the meat hooks, his back screamed with every movement, and he'd lost 10 pounds from the physical demands of the work, but he'd earned $9, $9 for 6 days of work, more money than he'd seen in a month in Lithuania. Ona found work in the canning department, where women processed the meat that wasn't suitable for retail sale. Scraps and offal and pieces too small or too tough for the regular cuts were ground up, seasoned and packed into tin cans labeled with brands that consumers across America would recognize and trust. The canning department was considered women's work, which meant it paid less than the killing floors, but was supposedly safer and more suitable for female constitutions. In reality, it was its own kind of hell. The women stood for 10 hours a day in poorly ventilated rooms, breathing chemical preservatives and the sweet sick smell of meat that was often past its prime. The whistle that marked the beginning and end of each workday was more than a signal, it was the heartbeat of Packingtown, the rhythm that governed every aspect of life. At 5:30 each morning, it pulled men from their beds and drove them toward the killing floors. At 6 each evening, it released them back to their families, exhausted and diminished by another day of mechanized brutality. The whistle knew no holidays, no mercy, no recognition of human need for rest or dignity or hope. Between those two daily signals, human beings were transformed into components of an industrial machine designed for maximum efficiency and minimum cost. The fact that those components happened to be living, breathing, feeling people with families and dreams and fears was irrelevant to the machinery of profit. What mattered was that the cattle kept moving down the line, that the carcasses kept being processed, that the canned goods kept rolling out to American dinner tables where families would never know the price in human suffering that their affordable meals had cost. The immigrants who made this system possible remained invisible to the consumers who benefited from their labor. They were names in ledgers, numbers in production reports, statistics in quarterly earnings statements. They were not seen as the husbands who came home too exhausted to play with their children, the wives who miscarried because of exposure to industrial chemicals, the children who grew up breathing poisoned air because their parents had no choice but to live where the work was. The human cost was carefully hidden behind brand names and advertising slogans that promised quality and wholesomeness while concealing the reality of their production. But truth has a way of demanding to be told, and the truth about Packingtown was too massive and too morally urgent to remain hidden forever. In the saloons and churches, in the cramped tenement rooms, and on the killing floors themselves, people were beginning to speak about what they had witnessed and endured. The stories were being gathered, the evidence was being documented, the moral case was being built. Someone would eventually find the courage and the platform to tell America what its appetite for cheap meat was really costing, and when that truth was finally told, it would change everything. The neighborhood itself would become a character in that story, not just the backdrop for human drama, but an active participant in the systematic destruction of human dignity. The poisoned air and contaminated water, the overcrowded tenements and company stores, the killing floors and canning departments would all testify to what happens when profit becomes more important than people, when efficiency matters more than humanity, when the promise of America is reduced to the simple mathematics of exploitation, and that testimony would finally force a nation to confront the true cost of its industrial appetite. They worked with their bare hands in conditions that would have horrified any housewife who bought the finished products. Owner earned $6 a week. Combined with Jurgis's wages, they had enough to pay the rent, buy food, and save a small amount toward the future they still believed was waiting for them. The neighborhood life of Packingtown revolved around the rhythms of the yards. Men left for work before dawn, walking through streets that were still lit by gas lamps, their lunch pails and work clothes marking them as clearly as uniforms. Women rose earlier to prepare meals and tend to children before heading to their own jobs in the canning plants, or staying home to take in washing or sewing that could bring in a few extra dollars. Children played in streets that were unpaved and often flooded, learning early that life was something you endured rather than enjoyed. The lucky ones attended school for a few years before economic necessity forced them into the factories. The unlucky ones started working as soon as they were strong enough to perform simple tasks, sorting scraps, cleaning equipment, running messages between departments. The saloons were the social centers of the community, not just places to drink, though certainly alcohol provided some relief from the daily grind, but gathering places where men could speak their native languages and maintain connections to cultures that felt increasingly distant. The saloons extended credit when wages were late, cashed paychecks for men who couldn't read English well enough to navigate the banks, provided information about jobs and housing and the 100 small necessities of immigrant life. Schnapps and beer were cheap, cheaper than coffee in some establishments, and infinitely more effective at dulling the physical and spiritual pain of life in Packingtown. A man who spent 10 hours on the killing floors could find in alcohol a temporary escape from the memory of what he'd done to earn his wages. The churches tried to provide a different kind of escape. Services in Lithuanian and Polish and Slovak, conducted by priests who understood the particular struggles of their immigrant congregations. The churches organized mutual aid societies, helped families in crisis, maintained connections to the old country through letters and occasional visitors. But even the churches were shaped by the realities of Packingtown life. Sermons about Christian charity and human dignity had to compete with the daily evidence that survival required the abandonment of such luxuries. Men who spent their days reducing living creatures to commodities found it difficult to maintain faith in the inherent value of life. Women who worked with spoiled meat and chemical preservatives, while pregnant, struggled to believe in a benevolent providence. The company stores were another form of control, though most residents didn't understand this until it was too late. Credit was easily available for families who needed to buy food and clothing and household supplies between paychecks. The prices were higher than in stores outside Packingtown, but the stores outside Packingtown didn't extend credit to immigrants with uncertain employment. The mathematics of the company stores were elegantly simple. A family that earned $15 a week might spend $12 on rent, food, and necessities from the company store. That left $3 for savings, enough to maintain hope for a better future, not enough to actually achieve one. And if a worker was injured or laid off, the debt to the company store continued accumulating while income stopped entirely. Families like the Rutgerses discovered that the promise of America was more complicated than the stories they'd heard in Lithuania. Work was available, yes, but work that consumed body and spirit in equal measure. Wages were paid, yes, but wages that disappeared as quickly as they were earned into the endless demands of survival. Opportunities existed, yes, but opportunities that seemed always to retreat just beyond reach. The children born in Packingtown grew up understanding that life was a struggle between the human desire for dignity and the economic necessity of submission. They learned English, which their parents never fully mastered, and with English came exposure to American ideas about individual worth and democratic participation that stood in sharp contrast to the realities of their daily lives. The second generation of Packingtown immigrants would become the conscience of America, the voices that finally forced the nation to confront the costs of its appetite for cheap, abundant meat. But that was still years in the future. In 1896, they were just children playing in polluted streets, breathing air thick with industrial chemicals, learning that the price of survival was the acceptance of conditions that no human being should have to accept. The neighborhood had its own ecosystem, its own economy, its own social hierarchies. The Irish who'd arrived first held the supervisory positions and looked down on the newer immigrants. The Germans maintained their cultural institutions and kept largely to themselves. The Scandinavians worked steadily and saved their money and moved out of Packingtown as soon as they could afford better neighborhoods. And the Eastern Europeans, Flynians, Poles, Slovaks, Bohemians formed the bottom layer of this hierarchy. The newest arrivals with the least bargaining power, the most willingness to accept conditions that others had learned to reject. But they also brought something else to Packingtown: traditions of resistance, folk memories of struggle against oppression, cultural practices that emphasized collective survival over individual advancement. They would become the foundation of the labor movement that would eventually challenge the absolute power of the Big Five. For now, though, they were simply trying to survive, trying to keep their families intact, their children fed, their hope alive in the face of daily evidence that the promise of America was more complex and more costly than they'd been led to believe. The neighborhood itself was slowly killing them. The air was thick with chemical fumes and particulate matter from the rendering plants. The water was contaminated with runoff from the slaughterhouses. The soil was poisoned with decades of industrial waste. The very environment they lived in was hostile to human life, shaped entirely by the needs of industrial production rather than the requirements of human habitation. Yet they stayed, because leaving required resources they didn't have, and because staying offered the possibility, however remote, that hard work and sacrifice might eventually lead to something better. Packingtown was America in miniature, a place where individual dreams collided with systematic exploitation, where hope confronted the machinery of profit, where the promise of equality met the reality of economic necessity. It was also the place where someone would eventually find the courage to tell the truth about what that collision looked like from the inside. What happens when hope meets the reality of America's promise. I remember the first time I walked down Ashland Avenue on a Sunday morning in 1895, when the killing floors were silent and the neighborhood could almost pretend to be something other than what it was. The smell was still there, it was always there, but softer somehow, mixed with the smoke from cooking fires and the sound of church bells ringing in languages most Americans had never heard. Lithuanian bells from St. George's, calling the faithful to services conducted in a tongue that carried the weight of forests and ancient songs. Polish bells from St. Joseph's, where men who'd worked all week with blood under their fingernails knelt before carved saints and whispered prayers in the language of their childhoods. Slovak bells from Saints Cyril and Methodius, where families gathered to sing hymns that their grandchildren would remember long after the yards were gone. On Sunday mornings, you could almost forget what Packingtown was built for. Almost, but the truth was waiting to be told. Not in sanitized corporate reports or political speeches, but through the lived experience of those who breathed the poisoned air, who carried the bloody carcasses, who raised their children in the shadow of the stockyards. How does a human body learn to become a machine? I remember the first time I watched a man's hands disappear into the machinery of profit. This was 1897, deep winter, when the lake wind cut through the walls of the killing floors like a blade searching for bone. The man's name was Antonazold Anthony. They called him, though he was barely 50, and he'd been working the beef line for 3 years when the accident happened. It was a Tuesday morning, just after the 7 o'clock whistle. The line was moving at its usual pace, one carcass every 18 seconds, a rhythm that had been calculated down to the heartbeat to maximize efficiency while maintaining what the supervisors called acceptable quality standards. Antinas was working the splitting station, using a steam-powered saw to cut carcasses in half along the spine. The saw was a marvel of industrial engineering. It could slice through bone and cartilage with the ease of a knife cutting butter. Powered by the same steam system that heated the buildings and ran the overhead rails. But like all marvels of industrial engineering, it required absolute attention, perfect timing, total submission to its mechanical demands. Antinas had made the same cut thousands of times. His hands moved with the automatic precision that came from repetition, from muscle memory so deeply ingrained that consciousness became almost unnecessary. Reach for the carcass, position it against the guide rail, engage the saw, step back as the two halves fell away onto their separate hooks. But this morning, something was different. Maybe he was thinking about his grandson, who'd developed a cough that sounded too much like the respiratory problems that killed so many children in Packingtown. Maybe he was calculating whether his wages would cover both rent and the medicine the boy needed. Maybe he was just tired, bone-deep tired, from years of 10-hour days and 6-day weeks. The carcass was heavier than usual, or perhaps positioned awkwardly on the hook. As Antinas reached to adjust its position, his left hand slipped forward just as he engaged the saw. The machine didn't hesitate. Machines never hesitate. It took 3 fingers cleanly, so quickly that for a moment Antinas stared at his hand without understanding what had happened. Then the blood began, and the screaming, and the sudden understanding that his life had just changed forever. The foreman Murphy, the same Irish-American who'd hired Jurgis, Rudcust shut down the line and called for the company doctor. Not because he cared about Antinas, but because blood on the floor created sanitation problems and injured workers disrupted the rhythm of production. The other men stood silent, watching as Antinas was helped away, each of them calculating how long it would be before the line started moving again. 15 minutes, That's how long it took to clean up the blood, restart the machinery, and resume the process of turning living creatures into marketable commodities. By 8 o'clock, it was as if Antinous had never existed. But he had existed, and his story was the story of every man who fed his body into the machinery of the meatpacking industry. The story of how human beings learned to function as components in a system that valued efficiency above all else, and how that system consumed them just as completely as it consumed the animals they processed. The work itself was designed to break men down. Not intentionally, the packers weren't sadists, just businessmen focused on profit margins, but inevitably, the human body wasn't designed for the repetitive motions, the constant exposure to extremes of temperature, the chemical and biological hazards that were built into every stage of meat processing. In the beef-killing department, where Georges Rutkus had started, men worked in temperatures that ranged from the scalding heat of the scalding vats to the bitter cold of the refrigeration chambers. They spent their days surrounded by the steam of hot water and the stench of blood, breathing air thick with particles of bone dust and rendered fat. The knockers, who killed the cattle with sledgehammers, developed specific types of muscle strain from the repetitive overhead motion. Their shoulders and backs gave out first, usually after 5 or 6 years of daily pounding. The men who worked the killing line knew to watch the knockers carefully. When a knocker started favoring one arm or moving more slowly, it meant his time was nearly up. The stickers, who cut the throats and let the blood drain, worked with knives sharp enough to slice through leather. They stood in pools of blood that never fully dried, their boots constantly slipping on surfaces made treacherous by the substances they were paid to spill. Cuts were inevitable, small nicks at first, then deeper gashes as fatigue and repetition dulled reflexes. The skinners had the most skilled job on the killing floor, but skill came with its own hazards. Their knives had to be kept razor sharp to cleanly separate hide from flesh, and the constant motion of peeling back tough cowhide created a specific type of repetitive stress injury. After a few years, most skinners couldn't fully straighten their hands. Their fingers permanently curved into the shape of knife grips. In the hog-killing department, the hazards were different but equally systematic. Hogs were slaughtered by having their throats cut while they hung suspended from hooks. The men who did this work, the stickers, stood beneath a constant shower of blood, their clothes and skin stained permanently red, despite the aprons and protective gear the company occasionally provided. The scalding process, designed to remove hair and soften skin, required workers to manipulate carcasses in vats of water heated to 140 degrees. Steam rose from the vats in clouds that made breathing difficult and visibility poor. Men working the scalding stations developed respiratory problems from the constant inhalation of superheated, chemical-laden vapor. The worst job in the entire operation was working in the rendering department, where scraps of meat and bone that couldn't be used for human consumption were processed into fertilizer, glue, and other byproducts. The rendering process involved cooking organic matter at high temperatures until it broke down into its component parts, a process that created smells so overwhelming that even men accustomed to the stockyards couldn't work there without getting sick. The rendering workers were the bottom of the hierarchy, usually recent immigrants who hadn't yet learned to avoid the assignment, or men who'd been injured in other departments and could no longer perform more demanding work. They worked in buildings that were poorly ventilated, breathing air thick with chemical fumes and the sweet, sick smell of decomposing organic matter. The company provided no safety equipment beyond basic aprons, no gloves for men working with sharp knives, no masks for workers breathing bone dust and chemical vapors, no safety training beyond the informal instruction that experienced workers might share with newcomers if they had time and inclination. Accidents were routine. The company kept records of major injuries, those that required medical attention or resulted in lost work time. But minor injuries were so common that they weren't even recorded. Cuts, burns, strains, and bruises were simply part of the job, expected costs of doing business in an industry that processed millions of animals annually. The speed of the work made accidents inevitable. The disassembly line moved at a pace determined not by human capability, but by mechanical efficiency. Men had to keep up with machines, had to match their biological rhythms to mechanical requirements, had to maintain focus and precision even when exhaustion made both nearly impossible. The speed-up was the packers' favorite method of increasing productivity. Instead of hiring more workers to process more animals, they simply increased the pace of the existing lines. A line that had processed one carcass every 20 seconds might be accelerated to one every 18 seconds. Then 16, then 15. The workers had to adapt or be replaced. The men who couldn't keep up were fired immediately. No discussion, no second chances, no consideration of years of loyal service. The foreman had lists of applicants waiting outside the gates every morning, men desperate enough to take any job at any wage under any conditions. Individual workers were replaceable components in a system designed to function regardless of their personal limitations or needs. The injuries accumulated over time. A man might start working in the yards with a strong back and steady hands. But after 5 years of repetitive motion and exposure to industrial hazards, his body would begin to break down. The lucky ones were transferred to easier jobs, night watchman, perhaps, or cleanup crew. The unlucky ones were simply discarded, replaced by younger, stronger men who hadn't yet learned what the work would cost them. Industrial diseases were common but rarely acknowledged. Bone dust consumption, tuberculosis caused by breathing particles of ground bone affected men working in the fertilizer departments. Respiratory problems from chemical exposure were widespread among workers in the canning and processing departments. Rheumatism and arthritis, exacerbated by work in cold, damp conditions. Crippled men who'd spent years in the refrigeration chambers. The company doctors, when they bothered to examine injured workers, invariably found that accidents were the result of worker carelessness rather than unsafe conditions. A man who lost fingers to a saw had been inattentive. A worker who developed lung problems from breathing chemical fumes had a pre-existing condition. An employee who suffered back injury from lifting heavy carcasses had failed to follow proper procedures. This wasn't malice, exactly. It was simply the logic of a system that needed to maximize profits while minimizing liability. Acknowledging that working conditions were inherently dangerous would have required changes that would have reduced efficiency and increased costs. It was cheaper to blame the workers and replace them when they broke down. The wage system reinforced this disposability. Most workers were paid by the hour with no guarantee of steady employment. Work was available when there were animals to process, unavailable when shipments were delayed or demand was low. A man might work 60 hours one week and 0 hours the next, with no way to predict or plan for the variations in income. The piece rate system used in some departments, was even more exploitative. Workers were paid not by the hour, but by the number of carcasses they processed. This created an incentive to work as quickly as possible, regardless of safety concerns or quality standards. A man working piece rate learned to value speed above everything else, including his own physical well-being. The company stores, where workers bought food and necessities on credit, created another layer of control. A worker who owed money to the company store couldn't quit without settling his debt, and settling his debt was nearly impossible on wages that barely covered basic living expenses. The stores charged prices that were often double what the same goods cost outside Packingtown. But outside Packingtown, immigrant workers with poor English and uncertain employment couldn't get credit. The boarding houses where single workers lived were often owned by the same companies that employed them. Rent was deducted directly from wages, and workers who caused trouble on the job could find themselves evicted from their housing as well as fired from their employment. The integration of work and housing gave employers total control over their workers' lives, but perhaps the most insidious aspect of the system was how it turned workers against each other. Different ethnic groups were assigned to different departments and paid different wages, creating resentment and competition instead of solidarity. Recent immigrants were used to break strikes and undercut the wages of more established workers. Language barriers prevented communication and coordination among men who shared common interests but couldn't recognize them. The foremen, mostly Irish Americans who'd started as workers themselves, became the enforcers of this system. They'd learned that survival required absolute loyalty to management, that the only way to escape the killing floors was to become complicit in the exploitation of other workers. They demanded bribes for job assignments, sexual favors from women workers, and complete submission from anyone who wanted to keep working. The system created its own justifying mythology. Workers who were injured or became ill were described as lazy or weak. Men who complained about conditions were troublemakers who didn't appreciate the opportunities they'd been given. Immigrants who couldn't keep up with the pace of the work were told they should be grateful for any job at all. That conditions in America were better than what they'd left behind in Europe. And sometimes that was even true. The wages paid in the stockyards, however inadequate, were often higher than what the same men could have earned in their home countries. The work, however dangerous and degrading, was steady employment in an economy where unemployment was always a possibility. The conditions, however terrible, were sometimes better than the rural poverty and political oppression they'd fled. This complexity made resistance difficult. How do you organize against a system that provides your only means of survival? How do you demand better conditions when accepting worse conditions is what brought you to America in the first place? How do you maintain human dignity when dignity is a luxury you can't afford? The workers found small ways to resist. They shared information about which foremen could be trusted and which ones demanded bribes. They covered for each other when injuries made it difficult to maintain the required pace. They maintained cultural traditions and mutual aid societies that provided some protection against the atomizing effects of industrial labor. But systematic resistance required resources and organization that most workers lacked. It required leadership from people who understood both the realities of industrial production and the possibilities of collective action. It required someone who could see the human costs of the system clearly enough to document them, and skilled enough as a writer to make that documentation compelling to people who had never witnessed those costs directly. The empire of meat had created its own internal contradictions. In pursuit of maximum efficiency, it had created working conditions so terrible that they would eventually provoke their own exposure. In pursuit of maximum profit, it had concentrated thousands of exploited workers in a single neighborhood where their shared grievances could eventually become the foundation of organized resistance. All it needed was someone to light the fuse. The machinery continued its relentless rhythm, the steam rose from the scalding vats, and the blood continued to flow across the killing floors. But something had changed in the winter of 1897. In the moment when Antinous lost his fingers to the indifferent steel, in the silence of the workers who watched him disappear, in the 15 minutes it took to clean up the blood and restart the line-in, all of these moments, the seeds of something larger had been planted. The human body had learned to become a machine, but it had not forgotten how to be human. In the shared glances between workers, in the whispered warnings about dangerous foremen, in the small acts of kindness that survived despite everything the system did to crush them, humanity persisted. The empire of meat had built its fortress of efficiency on the assumption that workers were nothing more than replaceable parts. But it had made a critical miscalculation. It had concentrated thousands of these parts in a single neighborhood, given them common grievances, and created conditions so brutal that they would eventually demand their own witness. The winter wind still cut through the walls like a blade searching for bone. But now it carried something else with it, the possibility of change. Not immediate change, not easy change, but the kind of change that comes when enough people finally understand that their individual suffering is part of a larger pattern. The accident that took Antinous' fingers was not an isolated tragedy, but a predictable result of a system designed to extract maximum profit from human flesh. And once that understanding began to spread, once workers began to see their personal disasters as collective problems requiring collective solutions, the empire would face its greatest threat. The foremen still demanded their bribes. The company doctors still blamed the workers, and the machinery still moved at its inhuman pace. But something fundamental had shifted. The workers were beginning to understand that their individual powerlessness could become collective power, that their shared suffering could become shared strength. The mutual aid societies that had started as simple survival mechanisms were evolving into something more dangerous to the established order networks of communication, coordination, and resistance. The empire had created the conditions for its own challenge by concentrating so much exploitation in one place, by making the human costs so visible that they could not be ignored forever. The voice that would articulate their suffering was already walking among them, though they did not yet know it. The pen that would document their exploitation was already being sharpened. The spotlight that would expose the darkness of the killing floors was already being prepared. The empire of meat had grown powerful by keeping its operations hidden from public view, by containing the human costs within the boundaries of Packingtown, by ensuring that the people who consumed the products never had to witness the process that created them. But containment was becoming impossible. The sheer scale of the exploitation, the systematic nature of the brutality, and the concentration of so many victims in one place had created conditions that would eventually demand exposure. The fuse had been lit not by any single act of defiance, but by the accumulated weight of 10,000 small tragedies, by the simple fact that human beings could not be reduced to machinery no matter how hard the system tried. In every workplace accident, that was blamed on worker carelessness, in every company store debt that trapped families in poverty, in every boarding house eviction that reminded workers of their powerlessness, the spark grew brighter. The empire of meat had created its own contradiction. The more efficiently it exploited its workers, the more obvious that exploitation became. And in the winter of 1897, with the lake wind cutting through the walls and Antanis's blood still staining the floor, that spark was ready to become a flame. What does a man see when he trades his name for the truth? I remember the morning when Upton Sinclair walked through the gates of the Union stockyards for the first time, carrying a lunch pail and wearing the rough clothes of a working man. This was October 1894. 7 weeks before he would emerge with a story that would shake the conscience of a nation. But that morning he was just another man looking for work, another face in the crowd of immigrants and desperate Americans who gathered each dawn outside the employment offices, except that Sinclair wasn't looking for work. He was looking for truth. He was 26 years old then, already a published novelist, but not yet the writer he would become. Born in Baltimore to a family that had known genteel poverty, the particular kind of deprivation that comes not from never having had money, but from having lost it and remembering what was lost. His father had been a traveling salesman who drank too much and earned too little. His mother had been a Southern belle who'd married beneath her station and never let anyone forget it. Sinclair had grown up watching the distance between American promise and American reality, but from the perspective of declining middle-class respectability rather than immigrant desperation. He'd worked his way through City College of New York, writing dime novels and juvenile fiction to pay for his education. He'd absorbed the socialist ideas that were circulating among intellectuals and reformers in the 1890s. The understanding that industrial capitalism was creating unprecedented wealth alongside unprecedented misery. But understanding was not the same as witnessing. Theory was not the same as experience, and Sinclair had begun to suspect that the story of American industrial exploitation could not be told effectively from the outside by writers who observed the system from positions of relative comfort and safety. He needed to go inside. He needed to see with his own eyes what industrial capitalism looked like from the perspective of the men and women who fed their bodies into its machinery. He needed to understand not just the economics of exploitation, but the human experience of it, the daily reality of trading. Physical and spiritual well-being for wages that barely covered survival. The assignment had come from Appeal to Reason, a socialist weekly published in Kansas with a circulation of over 500,000 readers. The editor, Fred Warren, had offered Sinclair $500 to investigate conditions in the meatpacking industry and write a series of articles exposing what he found. $500 was more money than Sinclair had ever seen at one time, enough to support his family for months while he conducted his research. But more than the money, what attracted Sinclair was the opportunity to write something that mattered. His previous novels had been commercial fiction, entertainment for middle-class readers who wanted escape from their own relatively comfortable lives. This would be different. This would be literature in service of justice, storytelling as a tool for social change. The plan was simple in concept, dangerous in execution. Sinclair would pose as a worker, get hired in one of the packing plants, and document conditions from the inside. He would live in Packingtown, eat in the same restaurants as the workers, drink in the same saloons, attend the same churches. He would become, as much as possible, one of the people whose story he was trying to tell. The first challenge was his appearance. Sinclair was obviously educated, obviously middle class, obviously not the kind of man who would normally seek employment on a killing floor. His hands were soft, his posture erect, his speech free of the accents and grammatical errors that marked most of the workers in the yards. He spent weeks preparing. He bought used work clothes and wore them until they lost their new appearance. He practiced walking with the slightly stooped posture of men who'd spent years doing heavy physical labor. He learned enough Polish and Lithuanian to understand basic conversations and enough broken English to sound like an immigrant who was still learning the language. Most importantly, he studied the culture of the yards, the informal hierarchies that determined who got the better jobs and who was stuck with the worst assignments, the bribes that foremen expected and the favors that could be traded for easier work, the signs that marked a man as experienced versus newly arrived, trustworthy versus likely to inform on his fellow workers. Getting hired was easier than he'd expected. The turnover in the plants was so high that foremen were always looking for new workers, and the standards for employment were minimal. Could you lift heavy objects? Could you work 10 hours a day without collapsing? Could you follow simple instructions and keep your mouth shut about what you saw? Sinclair could do all of those things, or at least fake them well enough to pass the cursory examination that passed for a job interview in the yards. His first assignment was in the beef-killing department of Armour and Company, working as a sweeper on the killing floor. It was the lowest job in the hierarchy, the position usually given to men who were too old or too weak for more demanding work. But it was also perfect for Sinclair's purposes. A sweeper could move throughout the plant, could observe every stage of the disassembly process, could witness conditions in all the different departments. The work itself was simple but exhausting. He spent 10 hours a day pushing a broom and shovel, cleaning up blood and scraps of meat and bone fragments, keeping the floors clear enough for the other workers to do their jobs safely. The constant bending and lifting left his back aching. The blood soaked through his boots and stained his clothes. The smell, blood and chemicals and rendering fat settled into his hair and skin, and seemed to follow him even when he left the plant. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to what he witnessed during those 7 weeks. Conditions that were worse than anything he'd imagined, practices that violated every principle of sanitation and human decency, a systematic disregard for worker safety and consumer health that would have seemed incredible if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. He watched men work with cuts and infections that should have required medical attention, but who couldn't afford to miss work or risk being fired for appearing weak. He saw workers who were so exhausted they could barely stand, but who continued working because the alternative was unemployment and starvation. He witnessed the processing of meat that had fallen on floors covered with spit and filth, meat that had been contaminated with chemicals and industrial waste, meat that came from animals that had died of disease or injury before reaching the killing floors, all of it processed and packaged and shipped to consumers who had no way of knowing what they were buying. The worst revelation was how systematic it all was. This wasn't the result of individual corruption or occasional lapses in standards. It was the inevitable consequence of a system that prioritized speed and profit above every other consideration. The packers weren't evil men. They were businessmen operating according to the logic of industrial capitalism, maximizing efficiency and minimizing costs. But the human and social costs of that efficiency were staggering. Sinclair began to understand that the workers in the yards weren't just victims of individual exploitation, they were casualties of a system that treated human beings as expendable resources, no different from the animals being processed. During his lunch breaks and after work, Sinclair interviewed other workers, learning their stories and documenting their experiences. He met families like the fictional Rudkuses he would later create, Lithuanian immigrants who'd arrived with hope and dreams, only to discover that American prosperity was built on the systematic exploitation of people exactly like themselves. He learned about the boarding houses where men slept 3 to a bed, paying exorbitant rents for accommodations that wouldn't have been considered fit for animals. He discovered the company stores that kept workers perpetually in debt, the corrupt foremen who demanded bribes and sexual favors, the industrial accidents that maimed or killed workers with devastating regularity. But he also learned about resilience and solidarity, the informal networks of mutual aid that helped families survive crises, the cultural institutions, churches, social clubs, fraternal organizations that maintained connections to old country traditions, while helping immigrants adapt to American realities. The early attempts at labor organizing, usually unsuccessful, but representing the stirrings of collective resistance. Sinclair took extensive notes, but he had to be careful about how and when he wrote them down. Discovery would have meant immediate dismissal and possibly physical violence. He developed a system of mental note-taking during the day, then writing everything down in the evenings in his rented room in a Packingtown boarding house. The notes became the foundation for a story that was part journalism, part sociology, and part literature. Sinclair understood that simply documenting the facts would not be enough to reach the middle-class readers who had the political power to demand change. He needed to make the experience of industrial exploitation emotionally compelling, to create characters that readers could identify with and care about. The Rudkus family became his vehicle for this storytelling. Georgius Rudkus was a composite character based on dozens of Lithuanian immigrants Sinclair had met during his weeks in the yards. Ona, his wife, represented the particular vulnerability of women in an industrial system that offered them only the most poorly paid and dangerous jobs. The extended family, old Antina's little Stanislavus, cousin Marie, embodied different aspects of the immigrant experience. But Sinclair's greatest literary innovation was his narrative technique. Instead of writing on that documented abuses from the perspective of an outside observer, he wrote a novel that showed those abuses from the inside through the eyes and experiences of the people who suffered them. This made the story more than just a catalogue of horrors. It made it a human drama that readers could experience vicariously. The writing process took months. Sinclair worked in a cabin in the woods of New Jersey, far from the industrial landscape he was describing, but close enough to his memories of the yards that he could recreate every smell, every sound, every sensation he'd experienced during his weeks undercover. He wrote in a white heat of moral indignation, producing pages that burned with anger at the systematic cruelty he'd witnessed. But he also wrote with genuine affection for the workers he'd met, with respect for their dignity and strength in the face of impossible circumstances. The most challenging part was deciding how much to include. Sinclair had witnessed conditions that were so terrible, practices that were so shocking, that he worried readers would dismiss his account as exaggerated or impossible. He made the deliberate choice to understate rather than overstate, to include only the most well-documented and verifiable examples of the abuses he'd witnessed. Even with this restraint, the manuscript that emerged was devastating. Chapter after chapter of systematic exploitation, detailed descriptions of unsanitary food processing, graphic accounts of industrial accidents and preventable diseases. The slow destruction of the Rutgers family became a metaphor for the destruction of human values by industrial capitalism. But Sinclair's purpose was not just to document suffering, it was to inspire action. The novel was explicitly political, designed to convert readers to socialism by showing them the inevitable consequences of unregulated capitalism. Jurgis's eventual conversion to socialist politics was meant to provide readers with a path forward, a vision of how the system could be changed. The finished manuscript was titled The Jungle, a reference to the Darwinian struggle for survival that characterized life in Packingtown, but also to the primitive, uncivilized nature of industrial capitalism despite its technological sophistication. Sinclair knew he'd written something powerful, but even he couldn't have predicted the impact it would have on American society. He'd aimed at the public's heart, hoping to inspire sympathy for the working class and support for socialist solutions to industrial exploitation. Instead, he would hit the public in the stomach, provoking outrage about food safety that would overshadow concerns about worker welfare. The novel would change American history, but not in the way its author had intended. The irony would haunt Sinclair for the rest of his life. He'd spent 7 weeks documenting human suffering, hoping to inspire a movement for social justice. Instead, he'd accidentally created a consumer protection movement that left the fundamental structures of exploitation unchanged. But the book had to be published first, and getting it published would prove to be almost as difficult as writing it. The story he'd uncovered was too dangerous, too threatening, too powerful interests, too radical in its implications for comfortable middle-class readers. The truth, it turned out, was not always welcome, even when it was desperately needed. Publishers feared the backlash. The powerful meatpacking industry wielded enormous influence over politicians, regulators, and the press. Many considered Sinclair's revelations too incendiary to print. He faced censorship, delays, and demands for cuts that threatened to neuter his but Sinclair remained relentless. He found a publisher willing to take the risk, and the book was finally released in early 1906, coinciding with increasing public concern over food safety scandals. The book immediately sparked a firestorm. Readers were horrified by the descriptions of contaminated meat and brutal working conditions. Public outrage forced government action, leading to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act in 1906. Sinclair's aim to inspire socialism was sidelined, as the focus shifted to consumer protection. Yet, the book's impact was undeniable, exposed the dark underbelly of industrial capitalism, and galvanized reform. The workers Sinclair had championed saw little immediate improvement. The systemic exploitation remained entrenched. Labor reforms would come later, slower, and through bitter struggle. Yet Sinclair's work laid the foundation for the progressive era's broader social justice movements. The novel endures as a powerful indictment of industrial capitalism and a call to remember the human cost behind progress. Today, The Jungle remains a seminal work in American literature and social history. Its blend of investigative journalism and storytelling pioneered a new genre of socially conscious writing. Sinclair's undercover journey reminds us that behind every statistic lies a human story, and that truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is a powerful agent of change. Sinclair's legacy is complex. While the jungle didn't ignite the socialist revolution he envisioned, it forced America to confront the dark realities of industrial capitalism. His courage to go undercover and expose uncomfortable truths set a precedent for investigative journalism worldwide. More than a century later, his work challenges us to look beyond polished facades and ask who pays the price for progress. The human stories behind economic systems are never just statistics. They are the beating heart of history itself. The novel's impact extended beyond policy. It inspired countless writers, activists, and filmmakers to use art as a vehicle for social change. The tradition of muckraking journalism owes much to Sinclair's fearless example. His work reminds us that storytelling is not merely entertainment, it can be a weapon, a shield, and a catalyst for justice. In the pages of The Jungle, we find not just history, but a call to empathy and action. The struggles Sinclair chronicled continues. Industrial exploitation, labor rights, food safety, and social justice remain pressing issues today. The Jungle stands as a reminder that progress requires vigilance, courage, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. It is a testament to the power of the written word to expose injustice and inspire change across generations. As we close this chapter, we remember Upton Sinclair's journey, an act of bravery and conviction. His story challenges us to question the systems around us and to seek the truth beneath the surface. The legacy of The Jungle lives on, a beacon for those who dare to confront injustice through words and deeds. The jungle of industrial capitalism remains, but so does the fight for justice. Through Sinclair's eyes, we see the enduring power of truth-telling, and we remember that every story, no matter how dark, holds the potential to light a path toward change. I remembered the morning when Theodore Roosevelt threw his breakfast across the dining room of the White House. This was March 1906, and the President of the United States had just finished reading excerpts from a novel that made him physically ill. Not metaphorically ill, actually, violently, stomach-churningly sick. The book was The Jungle, and Roosevelt's reaction was being repeated in households across America. As word spread about Upton, Sinclair's devastating of the meatpacking industry, but getting to that moment, getting the book into the hands of readers who could demand change had taken nearly 2 years of struggle against publishers who feared the economic and political consequences of telling the truth. Sinclair had finished writing The Jungle in the summer of 1904, but finishing a manuscript and getting it published were entirely different challenges. The novel was longer than most publishers preferred, more radical than most readers expected, and more dangerous than most businessmen could tolerate. The first publisher Sinclair approached was Macmillan, one of the most respected houses in New York. Their editor read the manuscript and admitted it was powerful, even compelling, but he also pointed out that Macmillan published books for middle-class readers who might not appreciate such graphic descriptions of industrial brutality. More importantly, Macmillan had business relationships with companies that advertised in magazines owned by the same conglomerates that controlled the meatpacking industry. The second publisher, Doubleday, was more encouraging. They recognized the literary merit of Sinclair's work and understood its potential commercial appeal, but they also insisted on sending their own investigators to Chicago to verify Sinclair's claims before committing to publication. They couldn't afford to publish a book that might be dismissed as socialist propaganda or discredited as factual exaggeration. The Doubleday investigators spent 3 weeks in the stockyards, interviewing workers, observing conditions, documenting the practices that Sinclair had described in his novel. Their report was unequivocal. If anything, Sinclair had understated the problems. The reality of industrial meatpacking was worse than anything he'd depicted in fiction. But even this verification wasn't enough to overcome Doubleday's concerns about the book's political implications. The novel didn't just expose unsanitary conditions. It argued that those conditions were the inevitable result of capitalist exploitation, that reform was impossible without fundamental changes to the economic system. This was more radical than most publishers were willing to embrace, regardless of its accuracy. Sinclair spent months approaching other publishers, each of whom found reasons to decline the manuscript. Too long, too political, too graphic, too risky. The publishing industry, like every other industry in America, operated according to the logic of profit maximization and risk minimization. The jungle represented significant risk with uncertain profit potential. Finally, Sinclair decided to publish the book himself, using money borrowed from friends and supporters. He established the Jungle Publishing Company and produced a small first edition that he sold primarily through socialist organizations and labor unions. The initial print run was just over 1,000 copies, but those copies began circulating through networks of activists and reformers who recognized the book's importance. Word of mouth spread slowly at first, then with increasing momentum as readers shared copies and discussed Sinclair's revelations. The socialist press began excerpting chapters and reviewing the book favorably. Labor newspapers praised it as an accurate portrayal of working-class conditions. Progressive reformers saw it as ammunition for their campaigns against industrial abuses. Word of mouth spread slowly at first, then with increasing momentum as readers shared copies and discussed Sinclair's revelations. The socialist press began excerpting chapters and reviewing the book favorably. Labor newspapers praised it as an accurate portrayal of working-class conditions. Progressive reformers saw it as ammunition for their campaigns against industrial abuses. The breakthrough came when the mainstream press began paying attention. Collier's Weekly, one of the most influential magazines in America, published excerpts from the jungle, along with editorial commentary supporting Sinclair's claims. Other magazines followed, recognizing that the book's shocking revelations would attract readers and sell copies. But it was the specific nature of those revelations that determined how the book would be received by the general public. Sinclair had included detailed descriptions of unsanitary food processing, not just to illustrate the contempt that packers had for their workers, but to show how that contempt extended to the consumers who bought their products. The same system that exploited workers also deceived and potentially poisoned the middle-class families who purchased meat from the packers. The descriptions that captured public attention were not the accounts of worker exploitation, but the scenes of contaminated food production. Sinclair wrote about meat that had fallen on floors covered with spit and sawdust, then picked up and processed without cleaning. About sausage made from scraps so spoiled that chemicals had to be added to mask the smell of decay. Most shocking of all was the account of workers who had fallen into rendering vats and been processed along with the animal remains, their bodies contributing to the lard and fertilizer that the packers sold to unsuspecting consumers. Whether this specific incident had actually occurred was less important than what it represented. The complete disregard that the industry had for basic sanitation and human dignity. Middle-class readers who might have dismissed accounts of worker exploitation as socialists, exaggeration couldn't ignore evidence that they themselves were being victimized by the same system. The realization that their breakfast sausage might contain rat droppings, that their Sunday roast might have been processed in facilities where workers relieved themselves on the floor, that their children's meals might be contaminated with industrial chemicals. This was personal in a way that workers' suffering was not. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Restaurants reported dramatic drops in meat sales. Grocery stores found customers refusing to buy processed meat products. The stock prices of major packing companies plummeted as investors recognized that public confidence in the industry had been shattered. But the most important reaction came from Theodore Roosevelt, who read The Jungle in early 1906 and immediately recognized its political implications. Roosevelt was not a socialist, he was a progressive, Republican who believed that capitalism could be reformed through government regulation rather than replaced through revolutionary change. But he also understood that public outrage over The Jungle created an opportunity to expand federal regulatory power over industry. Roosevelt's first instinct was to verify Sinclair's claims through independent investigation. He commissioned 2 federal officials, Labor Commissioner Charles P. Neal and social worker James Bronson Reynolds, to conduct a thorough examination of conditions in the Chicago stockyards. Their instructions were clear: document everything, confirm or refute Sinclair's specific claims, and provide the President with facts that could support government action. The Neal Reynolds investigation lasted several weeks and covered all the major packing plants in Chicago. The investigators had full access to facilities, interviewed workers and supervisors, observed processing procedures, and examined the sanitary conditions that Sinclair had described. Their report, submitted to Roosevelt in May 1906, was even more damning than The Jungle had been. The investigators confirmed that meat was routinely processed under conditions that violated basic standards of cleanliness and safety. They documented the use of chemicals to disguise spoiled meat, the processing of diseased animals, the contamination of food products with industrial waste and human filth. They found that workers suffering from contagious diseases were not prevented from handling food, that restroom facilities were inadequate or non-existent, that rats and other vermin had free access to areas where food was processed. Most significantly, they concluded that these conditions were not occasional lapses or temporary problems, but systematic features of an industry that prioritized speed and profit above every other consideration. Roosevelt now had the ammunition he needed to push for federal legislation regulating the meatpacking industry, but he also faced powerful opposition from the packers themselves, who had significant political influence and economic resources. The Big Five had spent decades building relationships with politicians and bureaucrats, contributing to campaigns and lobbying against regulation that might reduce their profitability. The Packers' initial strategy was to attack Sinclair's credibility, portraying him as a socialist agitator whose book was based on exaggeration and bias rather than factual observation. They published advertisements in major newspapers questioning his methods and motives. They hired public relations experts to discredit his claims and minimize the significance of the conditions he described. But this strategy backfired. When the Neil Reynolds report became public, independent federal investigators had confirmed what Sinclair had written, making it impossible to dismiss the jungle as socialist propaganda. The packers were forced to acknowledge that problems existed, while arguing that those problems were being corrected through voluntary industry initiatives. Public pressure continued to build throughout the spring of 1906. Newspapers published editorials demanding government action. Consumer groups organized boycotts of packing company products. Progressive politicians introduced legislation in Congress requiring federal inspection of meat processing facilities. The turning point came when Roosevelt decided to use the Neil Reynolds report as leverage against congressional opponents of meatpacking regulation. He threatened to release the full report to the public unless Congress passed meaningful reform legislation. The report contained details so shocking that even conservative Republicans recognized they couldn't politically survive its publication without having taken action to address the problems it documented. The legislative process was complicated by disagreements over how extensive federal regulation should be and who should pay for the costs of inspection. The packers wanted minimal regulation that wouldn't significantly disrupt their operations. Consumer advocates demanded comprehensive oversight that would prevent any repetition of the conditions Sinclair had exposed. Progressive politicians saw an opportunity to establish precedents for federal regulation of other industries. The compromise legislation that emerged was the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, signed into law by Roosevelt on June 30th. The act required federal inspection of all meat processing facilities engaged in interstate commerce, established sanitary standards for those facilities, and created penalties for violations of the new regulations. It also authorized the Department of Agriculture to reject any meat products that didn't meet federal standards. Passed simultaneously was the Pure Food and Drug Act, which created the Food and Drug Administration and established federal authority to regulate the safety and labeling of food and pharmaceutical products. Together, these two pieces of legislation represented the most significant expansion of federal regulatory power in American history up to that point. But the legislation also represented a compromise that fell short of what Sinclair had hoped to achieve. The new laws addressed the symptoms of industrial exploitation and safe food production without addressing the underlying causes, the economic system that made such exploitation profitable. Workers in the meatpacking industry would still face dangerous conditions, low wages, and systematic exploitation. The difference was that the meat they processed would now be inspected to ensure it was safe for middle-class consumers. Sinclair himself recognized the irony of his success. Years later, he would write, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." He'd wanted to inspire a socialist revolution that would transform American capitalism. Instead, he'd created a consumer protection movement that left the fundamental structures of economic exploitation unchanged. The book had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams in terms of sales and influence. The Jungle became one of the best-selling novels of the early 20th century, translated into dozens of languages and read by millions of people around the world. It established Sinclair as one of America's most important social critics and launched his career as a professional reformer and political activist. But it had failed in its primary purpose, converting readers to socialism and inspiring collective action by the working class. Middle-class readers were horrified by the unsanitary conditions Sinclair described, but they were less concerned about the worker exploitation that had made those conditions inevitable. The solution they demanded was government regulation to protect consumers, not fundamental changes to the economic system that created the problems in the first place. The success of The Jungle demonstrated both the power and the limitations of literature as a tool for social change. A single book could shock the public consciousness, influence government policy, and transform entire industries, but it could not, by itself, overcome the deeper structural forces that shaped American society. The empire of meat had been reformed, but not revolutionized. The workers who had suffered under the old system would continue to suffer under the new one, their exploitation now hidden behind federal inspection stamps that assured consumers their meat was safe to eat. The book that was supposed to change everything had changed just enough to ensure that the most important things remained the same. The regulatory reforms placated public outrage and secured consumer safety, but the entrenched economic system continued to grind down the working class. Sinclair's vision of a socialist awakening remained unrealized, buried beneath layers of compromise and selective reform. The story of The Jungle did not end with its publication. Sinclair continued to write, to campaign, and to fight for labor rights and social justice throughout his life. The novel became a cornerstone in the canon of American muckraking journalism and social critique, inspiring generations of reformers and activists. The novel's legacy is complex. It revealed the dark underbelly of American industrial capitalism with unflinching honesty. But its most enduring impact was arguably in the realm of consumer protection rather than labor revolution. The reforms it triggered improved food safety nationwide, but left many systemic injustices intact. Yet The Jungle stands as a powerful example of literature's ability to illuminate social issues and spark public debate. Sinclair's dedication to truth-telling and justice continues, to inspire those who seek to expose inequality and fight for change. The book's lessons remain relevant today as new industries emerge and old systems evolve. The balance between profit, worker rights, and consumer protection remains a contested battleground. Sinclair's story reminds us that exposing uncomfortable truths is the first step toward progress. The history of The Jungle teaches that exposing injustice is never easy or straightforward. It demands courage, persistence, and a willingness to confront powerful interests. Sinclair's journey shows us the impact one determined voice can have, even if the outcome isn't exactly what was hoped for. Though the book did not revolutionize the economic system, it forever changed the way Americans viewed the food they ate and the conditions under which it was produced. Its legacy is a reminder that progress often comes through imperfect steps, and that the fight for justice is ongoing. I remember the first federal meat inspector who walked through the Swift plant on Halsted Street. This was August 1906, 6 weeks after Roosevelt signed the Meat Inspection Act, and the inspector carried himself with the confidence of a man backed by the full authority of the United States government. His name was William Patterson, and he'd been a veterinarian in Iowa before accepting appointment to the newly created Bureau of Animal Industry. Patterson wore a clean white coat and carried a clipboard filled with forms that would determine whether the meat processed in the plant was fit for human consumption. He had the power to stop production, to condemn entire shipments, to shut down operations that didn't meet federal standards. After decades of operating without meaningful oversight, the meatpacking industry was suddenly accountable to someone other than its shareholders. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Floors that had been caked with blood and filth were scrubbed clean. Workers who had been processing meat with open wounds were sent home until they healed. Equipment that had been contaminated with rust and grease was repaired or replaced. The same companies that had fought bitterly against federal regulation were now spending thousands of dollars to comply with the new requirements. But the most significant change was not in the physical conditions of the plants, it was in the relationship between the industry and the federal government. For the first time in American history, corporate behavior was subject to systematic federal oversight, designed to protect public health rather than promote business interests. The Meat Inspection Act required that all meat processing facilities engaged in interstate commerce submit to continuous federal inspection. Inspectors like Patterson were stationed permanently in the major packing plants, observing every stage of production from the killing floors to the shipping departments. Nothing could be processed and sold without their approval. The Act also established specific sanitary standards that companies had to meet. Buildings had to be constructed and maintained in ways that prevented contamination. Workers had to follow hygiene procedures that minimized the risk of disease transmission. Equipment had to be cleaned and sterilized according to protocols developed by federal scientists. Companies that violated these standards faced serious consequences. Their products could be condemned and destroyed. Their facilities could be shut down until violations were corrected. In extreme cases, they could be prohibited from engaging in interstate commerce, entirely a death sentence for businesses that depended on national markets. The Pure Food and Drug Act, passed the same day as the meat inspection legislation, extended federal regulatory authority even further. It created the Bureau of Chemistry within the Department of Agriculture, which would later become the Food and Drug Administration. This agency had the power to regulate not just meat, but all food and pharmaceutical products sold in interstate commerce. The Act prohibited the manufacture and sale of adulterated or mislabeled products. Companies could no longer use dangerous chemicals to preserve food or disguise spoilage. They had to accurately describe the contents of their products and couldn't make false claims about health benefits. Patent medicines that contained addictive drugs had to list those ingredients on their labels. For consumers, these changes represented a revolution in food safety and product reliability. The federal inspection stamp became a symbol of government protection, a guarantee that products had been examined by trained professionals and found safe for consumption. Middle-class families who had been afraid to buy processed meat after reading The Jungle could now trust that federal inspectors were standing between them and contamination. But for the workers in the meatpacking industry, the new regulations represented something more complicated. The improved sanitary conditions made their workplaces somewhat safer and more pleasant. They no longer had to work knee-deep in blood and filth, or breathe air thick with the stench of decomposing organic matter. The federal inspectors provided some protection against the worst safety violations. Yet the fundamental structure of exploitation remained unchanged. Workers still earned wages that barely covered basic living expenses. They still faced dangerous working conditions that federal inspectors were not authorized to regulate. They had no job security, no protection against arbitrary dismissal, no voice in determining the pace and conditions of their labor. The federal legislation had addressed the symptoms of industrial exploitation without touching its causes. It made the meat safer for consumers to eat without making the work safer for employees to perform. It cleaned up visible filth without eliminating the economic pressures that forced companies to prioritize speed and cost. Reduction. The packers adapted quickly to the new regulatory environment. They discovered that compliance with federal standards could actually be profitable, since consumer confidence allowed them to charge higher prices and expand their markets. The inspection stamp became not just a requirement, but a marketing tool distinguishing them from unregulated competitors. More importantly, the packers learned to use federal regulation as a barrier against smaller competitors who couldn't afford the costs of compliance. The Big Five Swift Armor, Morris, Cudahy, and Wilson had the resources to build new facilities and implement required procedures. Smaller companies were forced out or absorbed. Federal regulation, intended to protect consumers and workers, had the unintended consequence of consolidating corporate power in fewer hands. The Big Five became even more dominant in the years after the Meat Inspection Act, controlling a larger share of the national market. The regulatory system also created new forms of corruption. Companies wanting favorable treatment cultivated relationships with key officials. Political appointees understood their futures depended on keeping good ties with the industries they regulated. The revolving door between government and industry became permanent. Officials left government for private sector jobs. Executives moved into regulatory positions, blurring lines between public interest and corporate profit. Theodore Roosevelt, champion of the legislation, declared it a success. He praised the transformation and held it as an example of government reforming corporations without destroying free enterprise. The law became a cornerstone of his progressive agenda. Privately, Roosevelt understood the limits. He acknowledged the laws addressed visible problems, but left deeper issues unresolved. More fundamental economic changes were politically impossible in early 20th century America. Upton Sinclair was openly critical. He supported regulations as better than nothing, but saw them as missed opportunities for real reform. Public outrage could have been channeled toward socialist solutions, eliminating exploitation rather than managing symptoms. Sinclair pointed out workers still faced economic pressures, working at speeds that made accidents inevitable, low wages, and arbitrary authority treating them as expendable resources. Federal inspectors monitored food safety but had no authority to regulate working conditions or protect workers from exploitation. Their job was consumer protection, revealing the class bias embedded in reform efforts. Labor unions found the new regulations made organizing harder. Companies used federal oversight as proof working conditions were safe, deflecting attention from ongoing exploitation. Immigrant communities experienced mixed effects. Sanitary improvements made neighborhoods somewhat more livable. Federal oversight reduced corruption, and public attention brought some social services. But poverty, discrimination, and economic vulnerability remained. Lithuanian, Polish, and Slovak families still faced cycles of exploitation that federal meat inspection did nothing to break. Children growing up in Packingtown after 1906 inherited a different world, but not necessarily a better one. Work was somewhat safer, meat cleaner, but economic relationships remained the same. Some children became labor organizers, Others escaped to the middle class. Many remained trapped in industrial jobs shaped by exploitation that destroyed the fictional Rootkus family. The regulatory system from 1906 became a template for future government intervention. Agencies overseeing banking, broadcasting, aviation, and more followed the model of expert bureaucrats protecting public interest. But these agencies reproduced the same limits, regulating symptoms, protecting consumers more than workers, and vulnerable to industry capture. Reform had become control subtle, effective, preserving power and exploitation beneath government approval. What happens when the revolution forgets the revolutionaries? The laws passed, the inspectors arrived, the headlines faded, and in the back of the yards the whistle still blew at dawn. Listen, ... Can you hear it? That hollow sound echoing across empty lots where the great stockyards once stood. Not the bellowing of cattle or the hiss of steam, but something quieter. The ghost of a promise half kept. Because here's what they don't tell you about reform: it's like trying to clean blood from wooden floors. You can scrub and scrub, but the stain goes deeper than the surface. The Meat Inspection Act changed everything and nothing. Federal inspectors walked the killing floors now, clipboards in hand, checking temperatures and sanitation. The rats disappeared from the sausage. The spoiled beef stopped reaching dinner tables. America could eat its meat with confidence again. But Judges Rudkasol, the real men and women who inspired Sinclair's character, they still arrived before sunrise, still felt the bite of January wind cutting through thin coats, still bent their backs over the same blood-slicked stations, knives moving in the same rhythm their fathers had learned. The machinery of death had grown cleaner, but it hadn't grown kinder. I remember talking to an old Lithuanian woman's have been in the 1970s, her hands thick with arthritis, wedding ring worn thin as wire. She told me about her father, how he'd worked the hog lines through the teens and 20s. After the book, she said, they painted the walls white, made us wear hairnets, but my papa, his back still broke the same way. The speed up never stopped. If anything, it got worse. Cleaner facilities meant higher expectations, more cattle through the chutes, more cuts per hour, the efficiency that Gustavus Swift had dreamed of, perfected under the watchful eye of federal oversight. The unions came in waves like everything else in Chicago, like the immigrants themselves, the amalgamated meat cutters and butcher workmen. Organized strikes in 1917, 1919, 1921. Each time, the companies brought in strikebreakers from the South. Black workers from Mississippi and Alabama, desperate for the same promise that had drawn the Lithuanians and Poles decades before. And each time, the same old song played. The companies pitted group against group. The immigrants resented the newcomers. The newcomers needed the work. Everyone blamed everyone except the men in the offices who counted profits, while other men counted their dead. There was a strike in 1920. One lasted 2 months. One found an old photograph in the Chicago History Museum. Hundreds of workers gathered outside the main gate, their breath visible in the winter air, signs held high in 3 different languages: fair wages, safe working, human dignity. But look closer at that photograph. See the shadows in the background. Those are the replacement workers, already moving through the side gates. The machinery never stopped. It just found new hands to feed it. The real revolution wasn't in the reform laws. It was in the technology that slowly, quietly made human hands less necessary. Mechanical stunning replaced the knocker's sledgehammer. Conveyor systems moved carcasses without strong backs to carry them. Steam-powered saws cut through bone faster than any knife. Each innovation promised easier work, safer conditions. What it delivered was fewer jobs. By the 1940s, a plant that once employed 3,000 workers could process the same volume with 1,800. By the 1950s, it was 1,200. The mathematics of industry had their own cruel logic. Human suffering reduced not through compassion, but through elimination. The workers who remained worked faster. The wages, adjusted for inflation, barely kept pace with 1906 levels. The American dream had learned to operate more efficiently. But the real story, the one that haunts those empty lots today, what happened to the communities. Packingtown had grown around the yards like moss around a gravestone. Generations of families whose entire universe centered on those 320 acres of killing floors and cattle pens. Kids who grew up knowing the sound of the morning whistle, the smell of the rendering plants, the taste of stockyard dust in summer air. What happens to a neighborhood when its reason for existing slowly disappears? The old-timers will tell you if you can find them. Mrs. Kozlowskis, who ran the boarding house on Ashland Avenue until 1987. Tony Kowalski, whose grandfather had worked the beef lines since 1903. Sarah Henderson, whose family came up from Alabama during the strike of 19. They watched the yards shrink. First, the sheep pens moved to Kansas City in 1953. Then the hog houses consolidated and automated. The great amphitheater where livestock auctions had drawn buyers from 3 states became a parking lot, then weeds, then memory. The Union stockyards officially closed on August 1st, 1971, 65 years after. Upton Sinclair had exposed its horrors to the world. The last steer walked the last chute on a hot summer morning, and then silence. Silence and the echo of what America had been willing to build on the backs of immigrants and cattle. The literature lived on. The jungle became required reading in American schools, sanitized, abstracted, turned into a lesson about the power of investigative journalism. Students learned about food safety laws and the progressive era. They memorized dates and statistics. But how many of them understood what Sinclair had really seen? Not just spoiled meat and unsanitary conditions, but the systematic grinding of human hope into industrial profit. Not just rats in the sausage, but souls in the machinery. The socialist message that Sinclair had aimed at America's heart, it got lost somewhere between the textbook and the test. We learned to regulate capitalism, not question it. We made it cleaner, safer, more palatable. We never learned to make it human. Today, if you drive through the old back of the yards, you'll see something that would puzzle those Lithuanian immigrants. Houses where boarding houses once stood. Gardens where rendering plants once smoked. Kids playing basketball on courts built over ground that once ran red with the blood of 1,000,000 cattle. But look closer. Look at the new meat-packing plants scattered across rural Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa. Look at the workers no longer Lithuanian and Polish, but Mexican and Guatemalan and Somali. Same desperate hope, same dangerous work, same promises whispered in different languages. The jungle didn't disappear. It just moved, found new swampland, new immigrants, new ways to turn human need into corporate profit. the inspection laws remain. The FDA still monitors. The machinery is cleaner, faster, more efficient than Gustavus Swift could have imagined. But the fundamental equation hasn't changed. Some people hold the knives and other people count the money. There's a small park now where the main gate of the Union Stockyards once stood. A historical marker, weathered and barely legible, tells the story in 3 paragraphs, mentions the economic impact, notes the regulatory reforms, thanks Upton Sinclair for his contribution to American food safety. But late at night, when the wind comes off the lake, the way it always has, you can still hear something in that empty space. Not cattle, not machinery, not the voices of long-dead immigrants calling to their children in forgotten languages. You hear the echo of a question that America never quite answered. What do we owe each other? What is the real cost of efficiency? How much human suffering is acceptable in the name of progress? The jungle asked those questions in 1906. They're still waiting for answers. The reforms came and went. The stockyards closed. The immigrants found new dreams in new places. But the shadow of those killing floors still falls across American industry, American labor, American promises. Because some stains go deeper than you can scrub. Some ghosts don't rest when you paint the walls white. Some questions don't disappear just because you pass a law. The long shadow of Chicago's meatpacking empire stretches all the way to today. And in that shadow, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echo of a socialist's dream and a nation's selective conscience. The whistle blows at dawn. Somewhere, it always blows at dawn. So that's the story, not polished or glorious, but worn, wind-beaten, and real. Tonight, we walked through the back of the yards, breathed the smoke from rendering plants that exist now only in memory, listened to voices speaking Lithuanian and Polish in dreams in languages that crossed oceans. We watched a nation confront its own appetite for meat, for profit, for the comfortable fiction that someone else's suffering is the price of someone else's prosperity. Upton Sinclair went into those stockyards with a notebook and a socialist's heart. He came out with a story that changed American law, but couldn't quite change the American soul. The reforms he inspired made our food safer. They didn't make our labor kinder. They didn't make our capitalism more human. The great Union stockyards are gone now, where cattle cars once rolled and immigrant families once hoped. You'll find community gardens and small houses, basketball courts and corner stores. The prairie grass grows through cracks in foundations that once supported the machinery of industrial death. But the questions remain. In every meatpacking plant from Nebraska to North Carolina, in every warehouse from California to Kentucky, in every place where desperate people do dangerous work so comfortable people can live comfortable lives, what do we owe each other? What is the true cost of cheap meat, cheap goods, cheap labor? How many people can we sacrifice on the altar of efficiency before we have to admit we've built something monstrous? Georges Rudkus, the composite character who carried the real experiences of real immigrants, would recognize the plants operating today. Different languages in the break rooms, different technologies on the killing floors, same broken promises, same dangerous work, same distance between the people who bleed and the people who profit. The jungle never disappeared. It just learned to hide better. But here's what else remains. The power of one person with a notebook and the courage to look. Sinclair showed us that stories can change laws, that fiction can carry truth more powerfully than statistics. that someone willing to walk into hell and come back with news can shift the conscience of a nation. Not completely, not permanently, but enough to matter. In the quiet space where those stockyards once stood, you can still feel it's a ghost of what we built and what we destroyed, what we reformed and what we left unchanged. The shadow of Chicago's meatpacking empire, stretching across more than a century of American dreams and American nightmares. The wind off Lake Michigan carries the same cold it always has. Somewhere, a whistle blows at dawn. Somewhere, people who came from far away, hoping for something better, bend their backs over work that breaks bodies and promises in equal measure. The story continues. The questions wait. The jungle grows in new soil, feeds on new dreams, counts new profits in the ancient currency of human hope and human blood. Thank you for walking through this quiet hour with me, for listening to voices from Chicago's killing floors and tenement houses. I hope you found some peace in the telling, some rest in the remembering. If this journey through America's industrial shadows brought you something comfort, knowledge, a moment's reflection on the cost of progress, consider letting me know with a like or by joining this small community of fellow travelers through forgotten history. Leave a comment about where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you in a city built on industry's promises, a small town that remembers when the factory was the center of everything, a place where immigrants still arrive hoping for the American dream? Tomorrow we'll find another path through the landscape of memory, another story hiding in the shadows of official history. There are always more voices waiting to be heard, more truths waiting to be uncovered in the quiet spaces between what we're taught and what actually happened. Sleep well. There are more stories to come. The wind is still blowing off the lake. The ghosts are still walking the empty lots. And somewhere in America, the whistle is still blowing at dawn. The wind is still blowing off the lake. The ghosts are still walking the empty lots. And somewhere in America, the whistle is still blowing at dawn. The legacy of the Union stockyards is more than rusted rails and cracked foundations. It lives in the stories passed down through generations, the sacrifices, the struggles, the resilience of families who shaped modern America. The immigrant voices that once spoke in a dozen tongues now echo in the cities and towns that grew from their sweat and dreams. Though the factories have closed and the machinery silenced, their impact continues in labor movements, food safety laws, and the ongoing fight for dignity at work. Today's meatpacking plants operate with far more technology and regulation, but many challenges remain. The workforce is still largely composed of immigrants and low-wage workers facing difficult, often dangerous conditions. The struggle for safe, fair work continues, an echo of the battles fought in Packingtown more than a century ago. The lessons from Chicago's stockyards remind us that progress is neither automatic nor guaranteed. It requires vigilance, advocacy, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. The story of the jungle isn't just a historical chapter. It's a mirror reflecting current debates about workers' rights, food safety, and corporate accountability. As consumers, activists, and citizens, we all play a role in shaping the future of industries built on human labor. Understanding the past helps us ask better questions today. Who profits from cheap labor? Who pays the real cost? And how do we ensure that the lessons of the past lead to meaningful change? As we close this chapter, remember that every reform began with a single person daring to look and speak the truth. Upton Sinclair's courage set off ripples that continue to shape our world, but the jungle adapts, hides, and re-emerges in new forms. Our challenge is to keep the light shining on the corners where injustice hides, to listen to the voices too often ignored, and to demand a more just and humane society. Thank you for joining this journey. History is not a closed book, but a living conversation. By engaging with these stories, we honor those who came before and empower those who come after. The work continues. Until next time, keep questioning, keep listening, and keep telling the stories that matter. The echoes of Packingtown can still be heard in the rhythm of factory whistles and the hum of conveyor belts. But now, those sounds mix with the laughter of children playing in parks where once stood towering slaughterhouses. The landscape has changed, but the stories beneath the surface remain. Remembering this history challenges us to reckon with the costs of progress and to ask what kind of future we want to build. History isn't just about the past. It's a guide to the future. The struggles of those who worked and lived in Packingtown remind us that justice requires more than laws. It requires empathy, vigilance, and collective will. The jungle's lessons teach us to see beyond headlines, beyond easy answers, to the human stories at the heart of social change. Every generation faces its own jungle, new industries, new challenges, new injustices, but the spirit of inquiry, courage, and solidarity that carried Sinclair through Packingtown can guide us still. By listening carefully and acting boldly, we can illuminate the shadows and hold power accountable. Upton Sinclair's notebook reminds us that bearing witness is a powerful act. It can rattle the complacent and inspire the restless. The jungle is never far from view, but neither is the possibility of change. In our own time, the courage to look, to listen, and to speak remains as vital as ever. Thank you for walking this path through history with me. Keep telling the stories. Keep asking the hard questions. The jungle's shadows will always be with us, but so too will our light. Until next time, stay curious, stay courageous.